Nobody teaches you what betrayal sounds like. You think it's a scream, a slammed door, maybe a confession whispered through tears at 2 in the morning. It's not. Betrayal sounds like your wife laughing while your blood pools on her mother's kitchen floor, the granite countertop still wet where your head hit it, and 37 people in the next room pretending they didn't hear you fall. Mine happened on a Saturday evening in Druid Hills, Atlanta, Georgia. I know because I was staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each drop of blood hitting Italian marble, when a woman I'd never met knelt beside me and said, "Stay still. I'm calling 911. Don't let them move you." I had never spoken a single word to Margot Leong before that moment, but lying there on that cold marble floor with my wife's laughter still ringing off the kitchen walls, I trusted her more than anyone else in that house, more than the woman I'd married, more than the family I'd spent 9 years trying to impress, more than myself. Honestly, because I was the one who'd walked into that kitchen thinking tonight would be different. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and make sure you subscribe. You're going to love it here. My name is Warren Hale. I am 43 years old. I work as a forensic accountant at a mid-size firm in Buckhead, Atlanta, and if you don't know what a forensic accountant does, I'll make it simple. People lie. Numbers don't. My job is to sit in a quiet room with a spreadsheet and figure out where the money went when someone didn't want anyone to know. I'm good at it. I'm patient. I'm precise. And I have a particular talent for noticing when something doesn't add up, which is probably why it took me 9 years to leave my marriage instead of 9 months. Because the one set of books I couldn't bring myself to audit was my own. For 9 of those years, I was married to a woman named Nadine, whose family, the Pratchetts, had built a small real estate empire in DeKalb County and used it as the foundation for an even larger sense of superiority. I'll give you a moment with that family. The Pratchetts. Sterling Pratchett, Corinne Pratchett, Palmer Pratchett, Simone Pratchett. 4 people who had confused net worth with self-worth so thoroughly that I don't think they could tell the difference anymore. Sterling was Nadine's older brother. He ran the family's real estate holdings with the confidence of a man who believed that owning property meant he owned the people standing on it. He was 41, broad-shouldered, loud in every room, and had the particular habit of shaking your hand just a little too hard, holding on just a little too long, making sure you understood the transaction. You were smaller, he was not. Corinne was the mother, the nerve center. She had lived in that colonial in Druid Hills for 31 years and treated it like a museum of her own importance. Every throw pillow was a statement. Every piece of silverware was a verdict. She smiled at me the way bank tellers smile at people whose accounts they've already reviewed and found insufficient. Palmer was the father. He said very little and did even less, which in a family like the Pratchetts was its own kind of power. He didn't need to say anything. He just sat in his leather chair at every gathering and let the silence do the work. Silence, when it comes from a man with money, has a way of sounding like judgment. And then there was Simone, the youngest, 28, perpetually on her phone, curating a lifestyle brand on social media that consisted mainly of brunch photos and inspirational quotes she didn't write. She would ask me about my job in that specific tone people use when they've already decided the answer is boring. "So, Warren, still doing the number thing?" The number thing. 9 years of postgraduate education and 17 years of professional experience reduced to the number thing. I used to think a family with that much money would develop some grace, some awareness that luck and timing played a role in where they ended up. That wealth might come with a little humility, or at least a sense of humor about the absurdity of it all. They did not develop any of those things. Instead, they developed an extraordinary talent for looking down on people who had less, which I suspect is what happens when your entire identity is built on a balance sheet and you need everyone around you to feel like a smaller number. The contempt was never loud. The Pratchetts were too polished for that, or at least they believed they were. It was in the pauses, The way Sterling would glance at my Honda Accord in the driveway, and then look away without a word, like the car had personally offended his property values. The way Corinne would compliment Nadine's dress and then look at my shirt and say nothing. The way Palmer would pour everyone a glass of his expensive bourbon and hand me mine last, always last, with a nod that somehow managed to be both inclusive and dismissive at the same time. 9 years of this. 9 years of showing up, being cordial, eating Corinne's overcooked lamb and calling it delicious, watching football with a man who had shoved me into a swimming pool at a 4th of July party and laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever witnessed. 9 years of smiling through a family that had collectively decided I was a line item they couldn't write off but wished they could. Then there was the Christmas party, 2 years before the night that changed everything. The Pratchetts hosted it at the Druid Hills house, 40-some guests, catered, decorated like a magazine spread. I was standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of wine, talking to a cousin of Nadine's who was one of the only people in that family who ever looked me in the eye. Sterling walked past, drink in hand, and bumped my arm. My wine went down the front of my white shirt, a full glass, red, spreading across the fabric like evidence at a crime scene. He stopped. He looked at my shirt, and he laughed. Not an apologetic laugh. Not an oh no laugh. The kind of laugh a man produces when he has done exactly what he intended to do and wants you to know it. 3 people nearby saw it happen. Nobody said a word. Nadine was across the room. She didn't see it, or she chose not to. And by that point in our marriage, the difference between those 2 things had become so small that it no longer mattered. I didn't react. I set the glass down, excused myself, went to the bathroom, and stood in front of the mirror looking at the stain on my shirt. I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter than anger, something more useful. I felt precise. I made a mental note. Entry number 1 in a ledger I would keep for a very long time. That was entry number 1. Entry number 2 came 6 months later, at a 4th of July pool party at Sterling's house in Brookhaven. I was standing at the edge of the pool, talking to one of Nadine's cousins, when I felt 2 hands on my back. Hard. Deliberate. I went into the water face first, fully clothed, and I went in at the deep end, which mattered because I'm not a strong swimmer, and Sterling knew that. Nadine had mentioned it casually at a family dinner years before, the way wives share small facts about their husbands without thinking about who's listening. I came up coughing. Sterling was standing at the edge with a beer in his hand, grinning. His buddy was beside him, laughing. Nadine was inside. She didn't see it, or she was told about it later, and decided it wasn't worth discussing. I drove home that evening, sat in my home office, and opened a new document on my computer. I titled it simply, Ledger. I typed the date, the time, the names of the people present, and a clinical description of what had happened. Then I saved it, and closed my laptop. Noted. Documented. Filed. That's the thing about me that Sterling Pratchett never figured out. I don't react to problems emotionally. I'm a forensic accountant. When I find a discrepancy, I don't start yelling. I open a spreadsheet. I label the columns. I start entering data. And I keep entering data until the pattern becomes undeniable. Entry number 3 was Thanksgiving. The whole family at Corinne's house. The long table. The good china. Palmer saying grace with the practiced disinterest of a man who'd been reciting the same prayer for 40 years. Halfway through dinner, I felt Sterling's shoe come down on my foot under the table. Not a brush. A deliberate, grinding stomp that sent pain up through my ankle. I didn't flinch. I finished my meal, helped clear dishes, drove home, and photographed the bruise already forming across the top of my foot. Purple and black, the colors of evidence. Date, time, description, photograph attached. Filed. 3 months after Thanksgiving, Sterling sent me a text message. I had declined to lend him money for what he described as a short-term liquidity issue. The message said, paraphrasing only slightly, that I should remember my place in the family, and that people who didn't understand loyalty tended to find themselves on the outside of things they couldn't afford to be outside of. He sent 2 more over the following weeks, each one sharper, each one saved, screenshotted, metadata preserved, filed with the same precision I would apply to any document that might one day be entered into evidence. Now let me tell you about what happened 8 months before the party, because this is where the story turns. Nadine asked me to look at her family's tax documents. A casual request. She was helping Corinne organize paperwork for the family's accountant, and she handed me a box of files and said, "Can you just make sure everything looks right? Mom's worried about an audit." The irony of that sentence would not become apparent to me until much later. I sat in my home office that evening, opened the first folder, and within 45 minutes I knew. The numbers were wrong. Not wrong in the way careless bookkeeping produces. Wrong in the way deliberate fraud produces. Shell companies routing money through overvalued properties. Rental income from units that didn't exist. Expense deductions for renovations never completed. Systematic. Methodical. Sterling Pratchett's fingerprints on every page. I closed the folder. Sat in my chair for a long time. Then I opened my ledger and created a new section. I titled it Section B, Financial. I should tell you about Odell Frazier. Odell has an office on Peachtree Street, a handshake that could calm a hurricane, and 22 years of experience listening to people who should have walked through his door sooner than they did. He is the kind of attorney who pours you coffee before asking a single question, then listens with the patience of a man who knows the most important details are always mentioned last. I walked into Odell's office 8 months before the anniversary party with 2 folders. The first contained the physical evidence, photographs, screenshots, dated entries documenting every act of aggression over 4 years. The second contained the financial evidence. Shell companies, fabricated income, fraudulent deductions, the entire architecture of Sterling Pratchett's creative accounting. Odell went through both folders slowly. Then he looked up and said, "Mr. Hale, what exactly are you expecting to happen?" I told him I didn't know precisely, but that when it did, I wanted the numbers to be right. He told me I was more prepared than 90% of people who walked through his door after something bad had already happened. Then he told me to keep documenting, gave me his direct number, and charged me for 2 hours, worth every decimal. There was one more thing, a name I'd been holding for 3 years. Kelvin Mosley. Kelvin had been a business associate of Sterling's before their relationship ended at a golf tournament in Marietta, where Sterling punched Kelvin hard enough to fracture his jaw. The Pratchetts pressured Kelvin into settling quietly. Money changed hands, papers were signed. But at a cookout 3 years ago, Kelvin had pulled me aside and said, "Between you and me, watch yourself with that brother-in-law of yours." He put me in the emergency room. The family bought my silence. I've regretted it every day since. I had noted that. Filed it. And 8 months before the party, I gave Kelvin's name to Odell, who found him in 48 hours. Kelvin Mosley had been waiting a long time for someone to ask him to stop being quiet. His statement was sitting in Odell's office before Sterling ever set foot in a police station. I should also tell you about Demetrius Cole. Demetrius has been my best friend since we were both 19, 2 broke kids sharing a terrible apartment near Georgia State when Atlanta was still a city you could afford to be young in. He is now a senior detective with the Atlanta Police Department, 6'3", unhurried in every situation, and has a memory like a filing cabinet built by God personally. Demetrius texted me that Saturday afternoon around 4. I still have the message. "You sure about tonight? Say the word and I'll swing by." I told him I was fine, that it was just an anniversary party, that I was a 43-year-old man who could eat overcooked lamb and make conversation for 3 hours without incident. I would be wrong about that, but not in the way you'd expect. We arrived at Corinne Pratchett's house in Druid Hills at 6:30 on a Saturday evening. The house was a red brick colonial on Lullwater Road, the kind of street where people hire landscapers to maintain lawns they never sit on and install security cameras to watch driveways that nobody threatens. Corinne had lived there for 31 years and maintained it with the meticulous attention of a woman whose entire identity was load-bearing on the structure. Every room was a statement. Every surface was a performance. Even the welcome mat looked like it was judging your shoes. The occasion was the 40th wedding anniversary of Corinne and Palmer Pratchett, 40 years. I remember doing the math on the drive over and thinking that 40 years of marriage to Palmer, a man who communicated primarily through sighs and bourbon, was either an extraordinary act of love or an extraordinary act of endurance. Knowing Corinne, I suspected the latter. There were maybe 40 people there. Nadine dissolved into the family the moment we walked through the door, the way a line item gets absorbed into a parent company. 1 second she was beside me, the next she was across the room, laughing, hugging cousins, complimenting Corinne's centerpiece with a fluency that I had never been able to replicate in 9 years of trying. I watched her disappear into them and felt the familiar arithmetic of being married to someone whose family treated you like a rounding error. I got myself a beer, found a position near the back of the living room, and prepared to endure. Sterling Pratchett found me within 10 minutes. Of course he did. Warren. He said my name the way you'd say a minor expense, something that showed up on the statement that you didn't remember authorizing. Sterling. I matched his tone precisely. He was a big man, Sterling. Played lacrosse at Emory, and never let anyone forget it. He stood beside me, surveying the party like he was appraising a property, calculating its value, deciding whether it was worth his time. You look tense, he said. You always look like you're calculating something. That's because I am, I thought, just enjoying the party. Sterling. He smirked and drifted away toward a cluster of his real estate associates, the kind of men who wore sport coats without ties and talked about cap rates like other people talked about the weather. I watched him go. I watched the way people moved around him, the way they laughed a little too quickly at things he said, the way they angled their bodies toward him like plants toward a light source that they needed, but didn't necessarily enjoy. Sterling Pratchett was a man who had mistaken proximity for loyalty his entire life. That's a dangerous accounting error. Proximity is a liability. Loyalty is an asset. Most people can't tell the difference until the audit. 3 hours passed. The party settled into that comfortable late evening rhythm. Music low, conversations overlapping, voices loosening with alcohol. Simone was in the corner taking photos of herself with various relatives, each one captioned and posted before the flash had faded. Corinne was holding court near the dining room, accepting compliments about the house with the gracious exhaustion of a woman who believed she deserved every one of them. I noticed Margot Leong again. She was standing near the bar with a glass of white wine, watching the room with the quiet attentiveness of someone who had learned long ago that the most interesting things at a party happen in the margins. She wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't networking. She was just present, in the way that very few people at that party were actually present. I liked her immediately and instinctively, the way you like people who seem to be counting the same things you are. I did not know then that Margot Leong was about to become the most important person in that room. More important than my wife. More important than Sterling. More important than anyone in the Pratchett family had ever been, or would ever be, to me again. That's when I heard Sterling's voice carry from the dining room. Loud, theatrical, performing for a crowd of 8 or 9 people who had gathered around him like shareholders at a quarterly meeting where the CEO was feeling generous with other people's reputations. He was telling a story. And in the story, the punchline involved my younger sister, Rochelle. I won't repeat what he said. I will tell you that it was the kind of comment that a certain type of man makes about a certain type of woman when he thinks he's in safe company and nobody who matters is listening. It was crude. It was specific. And it was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never once been held accountable for the things that came out of his mouth. He was wrong about the safe company. I set my beer down on the mantel, walked into the dining room, calm, measured, the way water is calm, right before it finds the crack in the foundation. The small crowd around Sterling was doing that uncomfortable collaborative laughter, the kind where everyone is laughing because everyone else is laughing and nobody wants to be the first to stop. Nadine was not in the room. Simone was, leaning against the doorframe with her phone half raised, watching her brother perform with the satisfied expression of a woman who had always been entertained by cruelty as long as it was directed at someone else. Say it again, I said. The laughter stopped. Sterling turned, smiled. There he is. Warren, buddy. I was just. Look at me, and say it again. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when they sense that something real is about to happen. Not manufactured family tension. Not passive-aggressive small talk. Something with actual weight behind it. The kind of weight that restructures everything it touches. Sterling's smile didn't waver. He was practiced at this, the performance of being unbothered. Lighten up, man. It was a joke. It wasn't funny. You're embarrassing yourself, Warren. Am I? He put his drink down, rolled his neck, and I saw it. The decision forming behind his eyes, like a number being calculated. Sterling Pratchett had been the biggest, loudest man in every room he'd ever occupied. And right now, in front of people whose opinion he valued more than mine, I was making him look small. He wasn't going to let that stand. He clapped me on the shoulder, hard, and steered me toward the kitchen. Come on. Let's talk in private. Just you and me. I moved toward the kitchen. He followed close behind. The granite countertop was 3 feet in front of me. I didn't see his hands until it was too late. That's the thing about Sterling Pratchett. He wasn't angry. He was deliberate. And what happened next was not an accident. It happened fast. That's the thing nobody tells you about violence. You expect it to unfold in slow motion, the way it does in movies, with dramatic music and meaningful eye contact and time to process what's occurring. It doesn't. It happens at the speed of a decision that was made before you entered the room. Sterling's hands hit my back with the full weight of a man who had spent his entire life believing that force was the same thing as authority. Both palms, square between my shoulder blades, driving forward with the kind of deliberate momentum that leaves no room for the word accident. My body pitched forward. The edge of the granite countertop met the back of my skull at an angle that I would later learn, from a physician who would use the word impact 3 times in a single sentence, was not consistent with a stumble. Then I was on the floor. The marble was cold. That's the first thing I registered. Not the pain, not the fear, not the sound of something wet hitting stone. The cold, Italian marble. The kind that Corinne had spent 4 months selecting from a showroom in Roswell. And it was pressing against my back like a sheet of ice. And there was something warm spreading underneath my head that was not supposed to be there. Blood. My blood. On Corinne Pratchett's Italian marble. The ceiling above me was white, detailed crown molding, a pendant light that probably cost more than my first car. I stared at it because I couldn't do anything else. The room was tilting. There was a sound in my ears like a frequency being tuned, high and thin and constant. I tasted copper. I felt my heartbeat in the back of my skull, each pulse pushing warmth down my neck, and I remember thinking, with the strange clarity that comes when your body decides to stop negotiating with your brain and just starts reporting facts, I am bleeding on the floor, and I cannot get up. Sterling stood at the edge of the kitchen with his arms crossed, not panicked, not guilty. Just standing there, the way a man stands when he's done something he's done before and fully expects to get away with it again. His expression was the same one he wore when he looked at my Honda Accord. Mild inconvenience. Minor line item. Not worth the paperwork. Nadine appeared above me. I want you to understand this next part, because it is the part that ended my marriage. Not the legal filing, not the attorneys, not the division of assets. This moment, right here, on her mother's kitchen floor. I looked up at my wife and I thought, here it is. Here's the moment she chooses me. That hopeful, stupid, persistent thought that 9 years of marriage plants in you, like a weed you can never fully pull. The last optimistic entry in a ledger I'd been keeping since our wedding day. Nadine looked down at me, and she laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not the uncomfortable exhale of a woman in shock. A real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere genuine, somewhere that has been thinking this for years and has finally been given permission to say it out loud. Get up, Warren. You're embarrassing me in front of my family. 8 words. I counted them because that's what I do. I count things. And those 8 words were the most expensive things my wife ever said, though she wouldn't know that for several weeks. Corinne appeared in the doorway. She looked at me on the floor. She looked at the blood, and she said, "Someone clean this up before the guests see." Not "is he all right?" Not "what happened?" Not "call for help." Someone clean this up. Her son had just slammed her son-in-law's head into a granite countertop, and her primary concern was the guests. I would remember that sentence when Odell Frazier asked me if I wanted to include Corinne in the civil suit. I would remember it clearly. Simone appeared behind her mother with her phone raised. She filmed 17 seconds of me lying on that floor. Me, bleeding. Nadine, standing over me. Sterling, arms crossed. She filmed it the way people film things at parties when something embarrassing is happening to someone they don't like. For laughs. For the group chat. She didn't know yet that those 17 seconds would become the most consequential content she'd ever produced. Far more consequential than any brunch photo or inspirational quote. Then Margot Leong pushed through. She moved past Nadine, past Corinne, past Simone and her phone, and she knelt beside me on the marble floor with a calmness that I recognized, because it was the same calmness I used when I found a catastrophic error in someone's financial statements. The calmness of a person who has already assessed the situation and decided exactly what needs to happen next. "Stay still," she said quietly. "I've called 911. It's 8:51. Don't let them move you." 8:51. She checked her watch. She gave me a timestamp. In that moment, lying in my own blood on Corinne Pratchett's kitchen floor while my wife laughed and my mother-in-law worried about the guests, I loved Margot Leong the way you love anyone who treats your emergency like it matters. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes later. The lead was a woman named Janessa Voss, mid-30s, no nonsense, the kind of person who walks into chaos and immediately makes it smaller. She assessed me with practiced efficiency, asked me to squeeze her fingers, asked me to follow her penlight. She looked at the blood on the marble, looked at the angle of the countertop, looked at where Sterling was standing with his arms still crossed, looked back at me. She picked up her radio and called for police backup. Not as a formality, not as protocol. She called with the particular tone of a person who has already made up her mind about what she is looking at. As they were preparing to move me onto the stretcher, Janessa leaned close enough that only I could hear. "I've seen this injury pattern before," she said. "My report will reflect exactly what I see." I didn't fully understand what that meant until the next morning. But I would. Hospital ceilings are all the same. Acoustic tile, fluorescent light, the occasional water stain that nobody ever explains. But the math I was doing while staring at one on Sunday morning at Grady Memorial was unlike anything I had ever calculated before. Because for the first time in 8 months, I wasn't preparing for something that might happen. I was calculating the cost of something that already had. The CT scan results came in at 7:42 on Sunday morning. The attending physician was a careful man named Dr. Akebe, who chose his words the way a forensic accountant chooses his columns, with precision and an awareness that everything he said was going to be referenced later. He sat beside my bed and laid the results out like a financial statement nobody wanted to read. Severe concussion. 2 distinct points of impact on the posterior skull. Hairline fracture along the occipital bone. Soft tissue damage consistent with. And here is where Dr. Achebe looked at the uniformed officer standing near the door, a forceful collision with a fixed surface, not consistent with a simple fall. He said impact 3 times during that conversation. Each time he made direct eye contact with the officer. I had not missed this. The officer had not missed it either. Demetrius Cole arrived at my room at 9:15. He arrived before Nadine did. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My best friend, who I had texted at 4 in the morning because I couldn't sleep and the ceiling tiles were starting to look like a spreadsheet I couldn't close, arrived at the hospital 47 minutes before my wife of 9 years. Demetrius walked in with 2 coffees and the expression of a man who had already read the overnight reports and was choosing his words the way you choose which column to audit first. He handed me a coffee, sat down, said nothing for a moment. "Margot Leong gave a full statement," he said finally. "Detailed. Consistent. She was standing 6 feet away and had a clear sight line to the kitchen. Good. The EMT's report flagged the injury as inconsistent with an accidental fall. She noted the angle of impact relative to the countertop and Sterling Pratchett's position in the room. He paused. Janessa Voss. She's thorough. She told me she would be. He looked at me with the particular patience of a man who has been a detective long enough to know when someone he cares about is holding back the important part. Sterling Pratchett is going to be asked to come in for questioning today. You understand what that means. It means his balance sheet is about to get a lot shorter. Demetrius almost smiled. Almost. Nadine arrived at 10:02. She did not come alone. She came with Corinne and with Simone, who apparently felt that the hospital room of the man she had filmed bleeding on her mother's kitchen floor was an appropriate place to be the morning after. The Pratchett family did not disappoint. Nadine looked at me with the expression of a woman who had been coached on the drive over. Concerned but contained. Sympathetic but strategic. The kind of face you prepare when you know the numbers are bad, but you haven't decided how to present them to the board yet. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "My head is held together with surgical glue, Nadine. The doctors say it's not serious though, right? That it'll heal?" There it was. Not "I'm sorry this happened." Not "I should have stopped him." Not "I love you and I'm scared." Just, "Is this going to be a long-term liability?" She was already calculating the inconvenience. She just wasn't very good at hiding it. Corinne stood near the window with her arms folded, looking at me the way she had always looked at me. Like I was an asset that had depreciated below its useful value and should have been written off years ago. Simone was on her phone. Of course she was. "We need to talk about how we handle this," Nadine said. "As a family." "Handle what?" "Dale." She caught herself. "Warren. Sterling didn't mean." "Nadine." She stopped. "I'd like you to meet someone," I said. Demetrius stepped out of the bathroom. He had not been in there for any particular reason. He had simply been waiting. Demetrius Cole is a patient man, and he has excellent instincts for theater. His badge was visible on his belt. The temperature in that room dropped about 15 degrees. "This is Detective Demetrius Cole," I said. "Atlanta Police Department." He's been briefed. Corinne unfolded her arms. Simone looked up from her phone. Nadine's carefully managed expression developed a crack, the kind of crack that appears in a foundation when the weight above it finally exceeds the load it was designed to bear. Demetrius said simply, "Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Pratchett. Miss Pratchett." He nodded at each of them in turn. "I'm going to need to ask you all some questions at some point today. Nothing to worry about right now. Just wanted to introduce myself." Nobody in that room said a word. It was the most beautiful silence I had ever audited. Here is what the Pratchett family did not know, sitting in that hospital room trying to compose their balance sheets. 8 months earlier, I had walked into Odell Frazier's office on Peachtree Street with 2 folders. They knew about the first one, or at least they would soon. The photographs, the text messages, the dated documentation of every bruise and every threat. That folder was the one they might have expected from a man who kept records the way I did. They had no idea the second folder existed. The second folder was about what Sterling Pratchett had been doing with the family's real estate holdings for the past 6 years. The shell companies, the fabricated rental income, the phantom renovations billed to properties that hadn't been touched. The overvaluations designed to secure loans against assets that were worth a fraction of what the paperwork claimed. Every transaction documented, cross-referenced, and annotated with the kind of precision that the Internal Revenue Service appreciates very much when someone hand-delivers it to their Criminal Investigation Division. The first folder was about what Sterling had done to me. The second folder was about what Sterling had done to the IRS. In my professional opinion, the IRS takes these things more personally. Odell had looked at both folders 8 months ago, slowly, the way a man reads something he knows he's going to be referencing in court. Then he looked up at me and said, "Mr. Hale, you understand that the second folder changes everything." I told him I understood. He told me to keep documenting. I told him I always did. Kelvin Mosley's statement had been sitting in Odell's file cabinet for 6 months before Sterling ever walked into a police station, a sworn account of the assault at the golf tournament in Marietta, the fractured jaw, the pressure from the Pratchett family to settle quietly, the money that changed hands, the silence that Kelvin had carried like a debt he never agreed to take on. Kelvin had told Odell, "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask me to stop being quiet about that man. I'm done waiting." Sterling Pratchett went in for questioning on Sunday afternoon. He walked into the Atlanta Police Department's Midtown precinct. The way he walked into every room, like he owned it, like this was a formality that would be resolved with a phone call and a handshake that squeezed a little too hard. He brought a lawyer. He brought the smirk. The smirk did not survive the meeting. It would be the last time Sterling Pratchett smirked for a very long time. Nadine came back to the hospital that evening. Alone. No Corinne. No Simone. No coached expression. No strategic composure. Just a woman sitting beside a hospital bed in the quiet hours, when the fluorescent lights seem to hum louder because there's nothing else competing for the silence. She sat there for a long time without saying anything. I let her have the silence because I could tell she was building towards something, and I wanted to hear what shape it took when it finally arrived. In my experience, the most important confessions come after the longest pauses. It's the same with financial audits. The number someone is afraid to show you is always the last one they mention. Finally, she said it. 9 words, quiet, barely above a whisper. I always knew Sterling would go too far someday. 9 words. No apology attached. No explanation of why she had said nothing, not before the party, not during, not when I was on the floor with blood pooling under my head while she laughed. Just the admission, offered now when it was too late to be anything other than a confession. I looked at her for a long time. "I know," I said. "And so did your mother." She didn't have an answer for that. "You kept his peace, Nadine." "Not mine. Never mine." The silence that followed was different from the one in the morning, the beautiful one with Demetrius and the badge. This silence was heavier. This silence was the sound of 2 people sitting in the wreckage of something that had been structurally unsound for years, both of them finally admitting that the foundation had never been level. She left shortly after. I went back to staring at the ceiling, and the math I was doing in my head was no longer about what had happened. It was about what was going to happen next. I want to be clear about something. I am not a vindictive person by nature. I'm a forensic accountant from Buckhead who drives a Honda Accord, and once spent 3 hours helping a colleague reconcile a spreadsheet that turned out to have 1 misplaced decimal. I don't lie awake dreaming about revenge. I don't have a dramatic bone in my body, but I am precise. And when the numbers don't add up, when someone has been cooking the books for years and everyone just looks the other way, you don't ignore it. You don't patch it. You don't pretend the discrepancy isn't there. You document it properly. You bring in the right people. And then you let the math do what math does. Math, in this case, took approximately 11 days. Let me tell you how it went for everybody. Sterling Pratchett was formally charged on Monday morning with felony aggravated assault. Georgia Code, Section 16-5-24. For those keeping score at home. His attorney immediately attempted to negotiate the charges down, which told me everything I needed to know about how strong he thought our evidence was. He was arraigned on Tuesday. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran a brief item, just a paragraph in the Metro Crime section. But the internet has a long memory and a short attention span for context, and several people who knew Sterling from his Emory days found the article very shareable. On Wednesday, I authorized Odell Frazier to forward the second folder, the financial one, to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. This was a separate matter from the assault. This was about the shell companies, the phantom income, the fraudulent deductions. This was about 6 years of creative accounting that Sterling had apparently believed would never be examined by anyone who actually knew how to read a balance sheet. He had been wrong about that. He had been married to the wrong sister's husband. The civil suit was filed on Thursday. Odell drafted it with the precision of a man who had been preparing for this particular document for 8 months. It named Sterling, personally, for the assault and Corinne as a secondary defendant on the grounds that she had knowingly hosted an environment where prior physical aggression had occurred and had taken no steps to prevent its recurrence. This was not a stretch. During discovery, text messages were pulled with a thoroughness that impressed even me. In one message sent to Nadine 14 months before the party, Corinne had written, "Keep Warren away from Sterling tonight. You know how your brother is when he drinks. You know how your brother is." She knew. She hosted the party anyway. She seated me next to him at Thanksgiving. She arranged every gathering like a chessboard and put me in the path of a peace she knew was dangerous. And now her assets were tied up in civil proceedings, and the house on Lullwater Road, the Colonial, the museum of her own net worth, was in play. Last I heard, it was listed. Sterling received the civil paperwork on Friday, 1 week to the day after my head hit his mother's granite countertop. I like symmetry. Accountants generally do. Simone's 17-second video, the one she had filmed for laughs, for the group chat, for whatever shallow currency she traded in, was subpoenaed as evidence. It subsequently found its way, through channels I was not involved in and cannot speak to people who found it as illuminating as I did. The response was not kind. Her social media presence, previously dedicated to brunch photography and borrowed wisdom, underwent a significant audience adjustment. The selfie she had posted at 11:14 that night, captioned "Best Party Ever," was discovered and screenshotted approximately 9,000 times before she deleted it. She eventually had to disable her comment section. There is a price for filming a bleeding man on your mother's kitchen floor and calling it entertainment. The price was several thousand followers and a public record she will never outrun. A bargain. Honestly, given the circumstances. The prenuptial agreement. This is the part I suspect Nadine thinks about most often now. She had laughed at the prenup 9 years ago. Laughed. She'd said it was unnecessary, maybe even a little insulting, that I would bring something so clinical into a marriage. I had smiled and said nothing. Odell Frazier, who I had been referred to originally by a colleague at the firm 4 years before the anniversary party for an entirely unrelated matter, had drawn it up. It was thorough. It was unambiguous. It had been signed by both of us in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary public. Nadine's attorney called it surgical. I'm told he said this with the slightly defeated tone of a man who has found the other side's accounting to be flawless in all the right places. She walked away from our marriage with what she had brought into it. Nothing more, nothing less. The math was clean. Before the divorce was finalized, Nadine came to see me once at the rehabilitation center. She sat in the visitor area, watching me relearn how to do things I used to take for granted, like standing without the room tilting, like walking without gripping a rail. It was the last real conversation we ever had. She sat in the visitor area of the rehabilitation center on a Tuesday afternoon, watching me walk between 2 parallel bars, with the concentration of a man who was reintroducing himself to a body that had temporarily forgotten how to cooperate. My physical therapist, a patient woman named Deirdre, who had the calm authority of someone who had rebuilt hundreds of people one step at a time, stood beside me with her hand near my elbow, not touching, just present. Ready? Nadine watched from across the room. She didn't speak until Deirdre stepped away to record my progress notes. "I should have told you about Sterling a long time ago," she said. "You should have. I thought if I just kept everyone happy." "You kept everyone comfortable, Nadine." "That's not the same thing." She didn't have an answer for that either. We sat there for a while longer, in the kind of silence that exists between 2 people who have run out of things to negotiate, and then she stood, picked up her purse, and walked out of the rehabilitation center. I watched her go through the glass doors into the parking lot, and I went back to the parallel bars, and that was the last real conversation we ever had. I don't tell you that to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you because 9 years is 9 years, and even bad structures leave marks on the landscape when they come down. You don't demolish something you built with another person and walk away whistling. You carry the footprint of it. You carry the outline. But you don't have to rebuild on the same foundation, and you don't have to pretend the old building was sound when it never was. 7 weeks after the anniversary party, I walked out of the Atrium Health Rehabilitation Facility on a Tuesday morning in late October, under a sky that couldn't decide if it was going to be gray or blue, and finally settled on both, the way Atlanta does in autumn when the city is caught between holding on and letting go. I walked out under my own power, slowly, with a scar on the back of my skull that would never fully disappear and a cane I planned to be rid of by Christmas. But under my own power, Demetrius was waiting by his car in the parking lot. He had 2 coffees. He is a reliable man in that way. Some people show love with words. Demetrius shows it with caffeine and the quiet act of being exactly where you need him to be without being asked. "How do you feel?" he asked. Like a man whose numbers finally add up. Good answer. Odell Frazier was there too, which surprised me. He was standing slightly to the side with a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who has something to hand someone and has been looking forward to it. He handed me an envelope. Sterling Pratchett accepted the plea, he said. 18 months, minimum security, mandatory anger management, 3 years probation following release. Kelvin Mosley's statement was the thing that closed it. Pattern of behavior. His attorney couldn't argue around it. I nodded. The IRS investigation is proceeding independently. That's a separate timeline, and I expect it to be a long one. The civil settlement from Sterling and Corinne is in there too. Covers your medical costs, rehabilitation, lost income, and, he paused the way. Attorneys pause when they're about to say a number that matters. Damages. I looked at the envelope. Is it enough to be inconvenient for them? Odell almost smiled. Very inconvenient. Demetrius drove me back to Midtown. I had sold the house during the proceedings, the house that Nadine and I had shared, the one with the kitchen where she used to hum while making coffee on Saturday mornings, before the humming stopped and the silence took its place. I'd found a smaller place, a clean, quiet apartment on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street, different end from Odell's office, with good light in the mornings, and no memories in the walls. I was starting to like it. That evening, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the firm in Buckhead. I hadn't been there since the Friday before the party. I'd been on medical leave, the kind where colleagues send careful emails that say thinking of you because they don't know what else to say. I was going back Monday. I was ready. I sat there in the quiet and looked at the building for a while, just taking it in. The familiar geometry of it, the way the late afternoon light hit the glass facade, the clean lines and right angles that I had always found comforting because they meant that someone, at some point, had done the math correctly. Structural, solid, still standing. My laptop was on the passenger seat. I opened it. An email from a former colleague, someone I hadn't heard from in years, inviting me to collaborate on a new project. I read it. Then I read it again. Then, for the first time in 7 weeks, I smiled. Really smiled. The kind that starts somewhere behind the sternum and works its way out before you can stop it. I won't tell you what the email said. You don't need to know. Some entries belong only to the person who makes them. Some conclusions don't need to be shared to be complete. What I will tell you is this. There is a number for everything. I've said that before, and I've believed it my whole life. But sitting in that parking lot, with the Atlanta skyline going gold in the late afternoon, and a scar on the back of my head that I'd earned by standing up for someone I loved, in a room full of people who thought standing up was the same as making a scene, I realized that the most important things in life aren't the ones you can count. They're the ones you can feel. The difference between patience and surrender. The difference between keeping the peace and keeping someone else's peace at the cost of your own. The difference between a man who stays quiet because he's weak and a man who stays quiet because he's waiting for the right moment to speak. God knows the difference. I believe that. God sees the entries that nobody else reads, the ones written in the margins of the ledger, the ones that never make it into the official report but matter more than anything on the public record. And God doesn't balance the books on our schedule, but He balances them. He always does. In His own time, in His own way, with a precision that makes even a forensic accountant feel humbled. Some balances don't need to be settled. Some ledgers just need to be closed. And some mornings you just need to close your laptop, walk into your kitchen, and make yourself a cup of coffee, and stand by the window and look out at a city that is still standing, and know that the numbers, finally, add up. I closed the laptop. I went inside. I made the coffee, and I stood by the window for a long time, watching Atlanta do what Atlanta does in autumn, holding on and letting go at the same time, and I thought about nothing at all, which was the most peaceful calculation I had ever performed. If this story found its way to you for a reason, I hope you carry something from it. Maybe it's the reminder that keeping the peace is not the same as having peace. Maybe it's the knowledge that boundaries aren't walls, they're declarations. Maybe it's just the understanding that some people will cross every line you draw until you stop drawing lines and start filing reports. Whatever it is, I hope it stays with you. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, because there are more stories here, real stories, about people who had every chance to do the right thing and chose not to, and about the quiet ones who waited and documented and let the math catch up. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know.